Hey y'all. Um, First of all, I apologize. I'm not apologizing. I was getting myself together. But I'm back now with part two. Okay, so in the last video, I discussed how I realized I had an issue with intimacy and commitment and actually liking people who liked me back. And that was what pushed me to seek counseling. So pretty much after I discovered like what was actually wrong with me, and I started looking up the attachment styles and things like that, piecing things together, and I was like, okay, well, how did I become fearful avoidant? And this is where things got tricky. So I'm like, okay, I have this fearful avoidant attachment style. How did I get the attachment issues? Where did that come from? And long story short, it was because of my parents. I also touched on the fact that our relationship with our parents dictate how we engage in relationships as adults. So basically, once I really looked into it and what causes it, and basically it can be a number of things. It could be from maybe if your parents were divorced or you grew up in a single parent home. Fearful avoidant attachment style, it usually, from the research I've done, it usually stems from like inconsistency in the household. Like it could be from maybe like sometimes you were validated with how you felt, or sometimes you could get, sometimes you received attention from your parents, other times you were ignored, sometimes your emotional needs were met, other times they weren't. It's like maybe sometimes your dad was around or your mom was around, but then you would have like long gaps between seeing them. Those kind of things cause fearful avoidant, because it's like you just never know how something is going to go. That rejection comes from the inconsistency. I mean, not the rejection, but the fear of rejection and the fear of abandonment comes from the inconsistency. But then because you're not used to the emotional availability, you're also like, you don't know how to respond to it when you have it. You've gotten used to shutting off emotions and expecting the worst, because it's like as soon as you get comfortable, things change. And I feel like that pretty much sums up my childhood. And not to say that my parents didn't do a good job raising me and that I was unhappy, because I feel like a lot of us, we don't realize that anything was wrong with like our upbringing until we get older and we start asking these questions. Because to my knowledge, like I had a good childhood. I didn't want for anything. I had love from both of my parents, but it's the subtle things that you don't realize affect you in the long run. And basically, it kind of got me thinking back on my childhood, and once I started evaluating, like I could see like clear as day how, okay, yeah, that's where my abandonment issues come in at. This is where my me suppressing my feelings come from. Long story short, my parents got divorced and we moved away. We moved out of town. My dad was in Virginia. We moved to Texas. So basically, I went from them being in the household together to when they got divorced, we were still both in Virginia, but I would see him on weekends. And then we moved to Texas, and then I would only see my dad for holidays and during the summer. And mind you, my parents got divorced when I was about 3 years old, I believe. So I honestly don't remember ever being in the house with both of my parents. And that's always put a strain on me and my dad's relationship. Not necessarily a strain, but it's just kind of, I don't want to say non-existent, because it's not. We have a relationship, but the emotional aspect of the relationship is kind of shaky. Yeah, I just feel like, and I think a lot of people kind of deal with this, especially from their fathers, because men are just not really wired to be emotional, especially when it comes to their daughters. But I kind of just always felt like I was in my dad's presence, but not necessarily connecting with him. Like I never felt like a true daddy's girl from what I saw like on TV or from other people, or how I felt like it was supposed to be. But I was just so used to it being that way that I never realized that it was affecting the way I engage with men. See, because I didn't realize I had daddy issues. I was in denial about, not even in denial, like I really didn't see it. In my mind, daddy issues was when like you didn't know your father or he just like abandoned you and didn't want anything to do with you. So the fact that I still saw mine, I was just like, oh, well, I'm good. My dad's in my life. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't see him all the time, but he's there. So I never thought that it was an actual factor. Like I said, I would only see him for holidays in the summer. So to me, that was normal. And that used to reflect like directly with the guys I date. I would always date men that were hot and cold. Like, things would be good for a while and then they would ghost and then come back, or it would always be off and on. It was never like consistent. My relationships were never consistent. And they were mirroring my relationship with my dad. Me and my dad's relationship was never consistent, you know? And not because of his fault. Like, you know, I understand there were factors that made it that way, you know? Like I said, I was all the way in Texas, he was in Virginia. Like, there's always been a distance between states, so he can't just drive to the house, you know? And that was something I had to deal with, because when I really looked back on it and started to, like, bring up these memories, it made me upset. Once I started to address the hurt, I was mad first. You know, that the anger was the first thing. Because I'm like, okay, you're the reason why I haven't had a successful relationship. So I went from blaming myself to blaming my dad. But then I started looking at the fact that I always hold my feelings in and never felt comfortable sharing them. And I feel like that part comes from my mom, because she's very, really all the women in my family are very strong. Like, they're very masculine in the sense that they're all independent. They all make things happen on their own. Like, nobody really discusses or lets things get them down. You know, like, we just keep moving, and that's how we were raised and taught. And that's how my mom raised me. You know, I never really seen her cry or break down or stress over anything. And even though she would never tell me that that's not the way to act, I learned by watching her. And then when I was younger, I used to always get teased about, not necessarily teased, but they would always, like my mom and my brother, just my family in general, they would always like laugh at me because I was so sensitive. Like, I would cry over the tiniest things, and I would always let things get me upset. Like, y'all remember those Feed the Children commercials where they show like the people, the kids in Africa that don't have food, and they play the Amazing Grace song in the background? I would cry every time I saw that commercial. And I remember watching A Cry for Help. That it's an old Lifetime movie with my mom, and basically the woman was getting abused by her husband, and I knew it was a true story. I knew it was based on a true story, and I cried like that whole next day of watching. Like, that's how sensitive I was as a child, just to give you like a quick overview. But there was always like comments made about stuff like that. Like, when I would cry, it'd be like, oh my gosh, you can't do nothing around this girl. Like, you got to be careful, or you don't have to take things so serious. And I know that they were harmful comments, but I didn't realize, like, I held on to that, and I internalized it, and it made me feel like, okay, well, it's not okay to show your emotion, and you got to suck it up. And like I said, I know they didn't mean it that way, but, you know, that was one of the things that I discovered. Like, okay, this is where this started, me feeling like I can't express myself. So I think that's where, like, the fearful and the avoidant come from. Like, the fearful part of it, me being anxious and clinging to people, I think that comes from my dad not being around and not being consistently in my life. And then the avoidant part comes from me watching my mom, like, not show emotion. So guess what? Once I figured this out, I'm like, oh, okay. So it's my parents. My parents is the reason why I ain't got no man. My parents is the reason why I'm struggling with the relationships. So I went from blaming myself to being mad at both of my parents. And it wasn't easy being mad at my dad, but me being mad with my mom, that affected me a lot, just because we have a really close relationship. And it was to the point where like when I was deep in my depression, we like I found myself being irritated around her, and I didn't know where it stemmed from. I was thinking like maybe it was just because, you know, they say when you're depressed, you lash out on the people that you care about the most. And because of like the love that I do have for my mom and how close we were, me processing like my feelings toward her and me being angry, it caused like a strain in our relationship on my end. And at the time I couldn't pinpoint why, but now, you know, obviously it's coming full circle. It was because I was blaming her for my unhappiness. And not only that, my mom has a son from a new marriage, and my dad also has kids from his marriage. And me kind of looking back on my relationship with my parents is completely different from the relationship they have with my brothers and sisters that were born after me. And that played a part too in me being angry, because I started to look back like, how come they're getting the treatment and attention that I didn't get? Like my brothers and sisters, they live in the same state with my dad, so they were able to see him a lot more. And I feel like, you know, from my perception, I look at it like, well, he's so close with them. I have two sisters and I have a younger brother that live in the same state as him. And I will always look at like his relationship with my sisters and be like, well, dang, I wish we could be close like that, you know. And it really started to come up around this time, and it started to make me not jealous, but just kind of like I missed out. So another thing I realized is that I don't know how to process sadness, or like I don't know how to process and articulate when my feelings are hurt, so it turns into anger when I'm really sad. So me being upset about me and my dad's relationship, like I said, it caused me to be angry at him. So this past Thanksgiving, I went to go visit my dad, and that was my first time seeing him since like my therapy and everything. And y'all, I was a mess. It was like, it's one thing when you're not aware of something, but to be aware of like the emotions that I was feeling and to kind of see it just play out in my face, it was hard to deal with. And it, like I said, made me upset. I was standoffish. I didn't really want to talk. I just kind of didn't know how to process. But that anger led to my solution. Let me tell you why. So I just remember that night the first night that I was down there, I was up like all night and I was sad and just kind of like processing it, because the thing is, I really didn't want to be mad at him. And the same with my mom. I didn't want to be mad at my mom either, because ultimately it's nobody's fault. You know, parents do the best that they can. And my parents, they got married young, you know, so they pretty much was growing up as we were growing up and just winging it, you know, which kind of explains too why sometimes your younger siblings will get, you know, different treatment than you, because they learn from experience, you know. You low-key a test dummy. Like, not not to call it that, but, you know, really, like, you know, it's a trial. You a trial child. I got to figure out how this works first, and then the stuff I don't get right with you, I get right with the next one, you know. But anyway, so, you know, I just remember I was laying in the bed and I was like, you don't need to be mad at him. It's not his fault. Like, you can't blame anybody. Nobody did this to you on purpose, you know. So I was kind of just Googling. That's one thing that I do. Instead of like calling people and telling them my problems, I'll Google stuff, or like look for a video, like a YouTube video or something, so that I can see like if anybody else has the same experience as me. Like, that's how I've always processed things without like reaching out to people. So I was basically just Googling, like, I think I typed in like why you shouldn't be mad at your parents or something like that. And this book popped up called Childhood Emotional Neglect. And I had never heard of that before, that term. No, the book is called Running on Empty. But it's discussing childhood emotional neglect and going into depth as to exactly what it is. And I'll actually put the link below, because this is what like brought everything full circle, like for real, for real. This is where everything started to click and make sense.